Bendy and the Ink Machine is one of the most visually striking games made in the last decade. It's gorgeous. Bendy and the Dark Revival looks... Is that the player's hand? It looks like Nintendo 64. Why does the ink look like drool? What's going on with her arms? Bendy and the Dark Revival looks the same as the first game. The characters, the environments, the ink, all of it. This is Bendy and the Ink Machine in 2K, and this is the Dark Revival trailer in HD. After 5 years, the long-awaited follow-up to one of the most popular indie horror games ever looks like a marginally improved reshade of the original game with slightly more detail in the environments. Really? Bendy and the Dark Revival is actually coming. Like soon. The game is going to be out on PC in 2 weeks. Naturally, a trailer was released, and like its predecessor, the game utilizes a hyper-stylized, cartoony aesthetic. It's certainly very striking, and don't get me wrong, the game looks really promising. I am excited to play it. However, I have some reservations. I've always felt that Bendy and the Ink Machine suffered from its episodic release format, and that the individual chapters were actually greater than the game in its totality.
You left me to rot! Why?
Kindly Beast started out like any other indie developer, and they couldn't afford to make all of Bendy at once. Thus, they carved the game into the chapters we now know, and sold them as they came out in an episodic release model. However, in my opinion, playing all of them at once reveals just how monotonous and repetitive Bendy's environments and gameplay are. In contrast, the Dark Revival appears to be a singular, standalone game, and I'm optimistic that perhaps the pacing and overall experience could be a lot better as a result. Just like I'm hoping you'll hit the subscribe button. Watching the trailer though, I couldn't help but notice that visually the game looked very similar to Bendy and the Ink Machine. It looks almost exactly the same. There's obviously a bigger budget for character models, more detailed set pieces, more voice acting and animated cutscenes, but looking at the environments, the game doesn't look that much more impressive. Bendy's hyper-stylized aesthetic where everything looks like it's an old Max Fleischer cartoon is still really cool and pretty, but we've seen it before, and I was really hoping that the Bendy sequel would knock our socks off again with something as unique and interesting as the cartoon aesthetic was 5 years ago. There's obviously a lot more detail in these areas, and that's appreciated. For example, the Heavenly Toys area has some more props and stuff, and it looks good, but that area looked great in the first game already. I feel like it wouldn't be that hard to add a few ripped up banners and some extra props for detail and get it looking nearly as good as what they showed in the trailer. They were obviously able to spend more time on these areas in Dark Revival, and that's what's most important, but considering the crazy technological advances we've seen in the last few years, I'm quite underwhelmed by what the game has shown so far, especially in comparison to the first game. Another big concern for me is variety. While the first Bendy game looked great, the areas get really old really fast. There's just a lot of brown, beige, yellow, and black everywhere. I think this worked okay when the game was being released one chapter at a time because players had months between them, so coming back to Joey Drew Studios was like revisiting a familiar old friend. Whereas today, we can play the game in its entirety and get really sick of the aesthetic. It just didn't matter as much going into each chapter's release because players had to have taken these large breaks prior to going into them. Thankfully, Dark Revival doesn't use an episodic release format. The entire game is coming out all at once. That's generally a good thing, and I'm optimistic that they can create a more coherent experience as a result, but it makes me nervous when viewing this trailer. The vast majority of it appears to take place in Joey Drew Studios, or at least somewhere that looks very similar, and it all looks just like the first game. Make no mistake, the lighting and detail does look better. In particular, some of the enemies look great. However, some of the character models look... This thing doesn't look very good. Is that supposed to be like ink skin on her arms, or is it a dress, or it just looks weird? We have what appears to be Alice Angel, and while the model has more detail than in the first game, she doesn't look that much better, especially when it comes to how the character is lit. I think this is one of the core weaknesses of Bendy's aesthetic. A lot of the detail is done using textures and neat shading tricks rather than actual geometry, and this gives Bendy its unique look, but it doesn't look as striking as it did 5 years ago. To me, it feels like, oh, this again? We are teased with what appear to be some outdoor segments, which initially got me very excited. The first game takes place entirely indoors, and thus there just isn't a ton of environmental variety. Even when we finally do get some in the final chapter, it's just a cave. We went from a brown office to a brown cave. Great. However, looking closer at this scene, it also looks like everything else in Bendy does. It looks very similar to the area before the carousel boss. Also, look at this car. It doesn't look very good. It doesn't look that much different from the first game. It's tricky because you can't simply up the poly count to make a game like Bendy look better. The game derives its aesthetic from these very flat, plain textured objects with thick outlines, and adding too much detail takes away from that. We can really see this in the ink. In the first game, the ink was incredibly shiny and reflective, which looked okay. It's very early Xbox release shiny, but it holds up decently. Unfortunately, Dark Revival uses the exact same look for the ink, and that's kind of a bummer. The ink itself is like a character in Bendy, and I was really hoping that they'd spend more time in the sequel making it look fantastic. It still looks like shiny metal instead of drippy ink. This dude looks like a mold monster from Resident Evil 7. This dude dissolves into like an explosion of light or something. It just doesn't look that great. Even the protagonist's arms, which in a first-person game you'd think they'd spend the most time on, look pretty janky. The right hand looks great, and the splotches of ink are exactly the kind of thing that I was hoping to see more of. However, the left hand just looks like a generic monster hand. It doesn't even really look like ink. Furthermore, there's all sorts of weird seams on the forearm, and they reflect the light back in a really weird way. This happened in the first game too, and it's a shame that more time wasn't spent upgrading the look of the ink. It's the follow-up to Bendy and the ink machine. It's kind of important that the ink looks good. Comparing the enemies, the models definitely look a lot better in Dark Revival. In particular, the enemies that aren't just ink blobs seem to have a lot of neat design flourishes. The shiny ink actually looks good as it oozes out of this monster's mouth. Maybe that's the problem. The ink looks too much like spit. That's probably why it looks good here. Still, I have to draw your attention to the player character's hand, which looks like Nintendo 64. Did they seriously think that looked good enough to be trailer-worthy? Come on. Don't get me wrong, I'm cautiously optimistic for Bendy in the Dark Revival, and I'll be playing it when it comes out. I hope it's good. I'm spending my money on it just like everyone else. There are a lot of controversies surrounding the developers and their studio, lawsuits, etc., but none of that really matters to me when evaluating the quality of the game itself. If it's good, even if the people who make it are assholes. There's also like a mini controversy regarding the Dark Revival trailer being incredibly akin to that of BioShock, but I don't think this is that big a deal. Bendy has always been heavily inspired by BioShock, and frankly, I don't care if games copy good ideas from each other. Call me selfish, but as long as the result is us getting more cool games, who cares if developers lift each other's ideas? So yeah, Bendy's presentation and sequences are obviously highly derivative of BioShock, so what? Ultimately, looks are not everything, and like its predecessor, Dark Revival certainly appears to be a very sharp-looking, stylish game. However, we've seen this before, and I can't help but feel that rehashing the exact same aesthetic diminishes a lot of what made Bendy so hype in the first place. The original game's look is so iconic and has become so timeless, it will probably always look good, similar to other stylized games like Wind Waker. The downside is, the trick doesn't work twice. Bendy in the Dark Revival looks just as cool as its predecessor, but I don't really see how it could ever substantially top the first game without completely abandoning its aesthetic. It would have to do something new entirely, and at that point, would it even feel like Bendy? We're left with an incremental upgrade that looks better than Bendy did when it released 5 years ago, but it's just not as exciting as it was back then. I hope it's good though. Thanks for watching.
You needed some help.
Don't touch me.
Above everything else, stay away from the ink demon.
What's an ink demon?
It's a car that Mike Mood bought.